Hey guys, welcome to part 10 of this Ozone 7 tutorial course where we're going to be diving into the dynamic EQ. So I'm not going in order of the different modules. I'm doing all the equalizers, then we're going to look at the dynamics, then we're going to look at things like the exciter, the vintage tape, and then the imager and the maximizer. So I'm going a little bit in the order in which you'd kind of use them and kind of grouping them together in that. So the dynamic EQ. It's basically Ozone's fancy name for a multi-band compressor, but it's basically an EQ that has the added power of compression. So it's a really awesome tool, and the cool thing is once you see and understand what's going on with the equalizer, which we've already covered in depth, you'll notice that the interface looks actually pretty similar. You have up to 6 bands, so it's a 6-band multi-pressor or multi-band compressor. And you'll notice right off the bat that if you're looking at the curve shapes and comparing them, you'll see different curve shapes than you do with the actual equalizer. You can see here, you don't have the high passes, the low shelves, the high shelf, and the low pass. You have a lot more different types of, you got a backsandal, bass, band shelf, peak bell, proportional Q, and backsandal treble. So these will look different. If you load up some presets into the dynamic EQ, you'll notice that the shapes will range from little notches kind of cut out and little boosts to whole sections just kind of boosted up. Now you can either expand or compress with this, so that's why it's called the dynamic EQ, not necessarily just a multi-band compressor, because you can accentuate certain frequencies. Like if you want to let's say enhance the low end, you see how the preset used the backsandal bass and it's boosting it, so that's actually going to increase the presence of the low end.
Looking in the mirror of who I see, I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling out the truth is that I got nothing left to lose. Climbing mountains
and you can hear that it's tuned nicely. It's not an incredibly noticeable effect. So you have this threshold control and inverse mode, and then you can actually see what's going on with the knee of your compressor. But I wanted to talk about the layout a little bit more before we get to that. But the layout's pretty similar, right? You have the different bands that you can load up. You can turn on and off by clicking on this little power symbol. You can just double click anywhere in between or on the point, and it'll activate the band that's closest to that naturally in its frequency spectrum. And then you have the option between analog and digital. So if you're trying to color the sound, analog is going to be a little bit better of a choice. If you just want some surgical kind of precise edits to certain frequencies and you want to kind of do some multi-band style compression or expansion with it, I would suggest using the digital mode. Now, the cool thing is you have these different shelves, and let's go through some of these right now. So the backsandal, let me get these off. The backsandal bass, that's going to just increase. You can move it all the way up, but it's used just to increase the bass presence. Then you get a band shelf. Now a band shelf is going to be just a way to notch and boost up some frequencies within the frequency. So maybe you're trying to reduce some of the mud, so you might reduce around 200 to 400.
looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
Right? And let's say you wanted to do a peak bell. This would be good for trying to maybe accentuate certain frequencies, because the cut is not, the ramp up into the top of the actual curve itself isn't extreme. With the band shelf, it's a little bit more noticeable. It's steeper. Then you get proportionate Q. That's a cool one to do kind of surgical, precise edits with. And then finally you get the backsandal treble. You'd never want to use the backsandal treble on the first band. It'd make more sense to go over to band 6 to do that, and then click on it and choose backsandal treble, as opposed to what I was just doing. That would be wrong. I was just showing you that just to show you the what different curves do and what they kind of look like. So you'll also notice that you don't have the different viewing options. Remember, with the equalizer, you had these 3 different viewing options. With the dynamic EQ, you don't get that, but you do still get stereo, mid-side, and left and right. So you basically have mid-side dynamic EQ or mid-side multi-band compression, if you want to think of it like that. And you also have left and right. So it's a very powerful tool. Let's close this out and let's load up another preset here.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living.
So you'll notice that you get functions where you can control the Q here, just like you can with the and the depth of the frequencies, or how much that frequency is going to be compressed. And it's the same as the EQ, so nothing changed there. You just don't have the controls down here to do that, like you do in the EQ itself, the actual main equalizer. All right, so now we've gone over some of the basics and just discussed what the dynamic EQ is in principle. I wanted to go through some of the different parts of this module in more depth. So analog versus digital, when would you use one versus the other? Well, we've already touched on what the analog and digital modes do in the EQ, but in the context of using it with a multiband compressor or even an expander, I would prefer to use it in the analog more often than not. The analog filter is going to be using a minimum phase filter, which we talked about in the last video, whereas the digital mode is set to linear phase. So if you want to get very surgical and precise, I would use digital, but I personally like having a little bit of the color, and I feel like most people, when they're using a multiband compressor in a mastering environment, would prefer to get a little bit of color, a little bit of vibe to the sound, to the frequencies that they are coloring or trying to bring out or trying to reduce. And the digital will hit your CPU a little bit harder because it is linear phase. Now we already touched on these filter types in a pretty good depth. Down here you have controls that will actually control each of the bells. So if you don't like doing the dragging and manipulating the curve shape up in the actual visualizer section, you can do it here as well. Just make sure you're clicking on the curve and select your curve shape, and you can do it that way, and you can move frequencies around if you need to. Next we're going to talk about the threshold and all of the kind of controls for the compression part of the EQ. So to understand this, you need to know a little bit about multiband compression. And the reason why the dynamic EQ isn't called multiband compression or a multiband compressor is because it's also an expander, depending on how you set your curve shape and how you set some of the settings in this section of the module right here. So the threshold is going to adjust the amount of compression applied to the band of EQ that you're on. So for instance, if I turn this up here, and I set the threshold to 0 decibels.
Get started. All I need is just me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000 mistakes spelling out the truth. Truth is that I got nothing left to lose. Climbing mountains and I love this view. Oh.
It works in the same way as a compressor. You set the threshold. Higher thresholds are going to have more, or lower thresholds are going to have more of an effect, because if you set it to 0 decibels, it's not going to have a huge amount. You can set the attack time here. You can set the release time, so you can kind of make it pump, you can kind of make it subtle. It just depends what you're going for.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. 1,000
All right, so this attack is going to adjust the compressor's attack time, pretty basic stuff. The release is going to be the release time in milliseconds. Now, auto scale is kind of cool. The auto scale is when you turn it on, it'll illuminate blue. What will happen is Ozone's going to try and detect the attack and release time. It's going to kind of give you this is what it thinks it should be based on frequency.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me.
So you'll see as I move this around, the auto scale is going to change based on how much of frequencies I'm trying to cut or boost and where that frequency actually is. So it's kind of cool to play around with. Now let's talk about this inverse mode. I saved that for last because it's quite cool. So let me load up a preset here. We'll do high-end presence. So if I click on 2, you can see that it's on auto scale. If I click on 1, it's on inverse mode. And if I click on 5, it's auto scale normal, and 6 is normal as well. So inverse mode, what's happening with this one right here?
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the
So in its normal mode, when inverse mode is off, the dynamic EQ is acting like just like any multi-band compressor. But when you do this inverse mode, it can actually act as an expander. So in the normal mode, the dynamic EQ is going to be just your typical run-of-the-mill multi-band compressor. So as any audio exceeds the threshold, boosts are reduced and cuts are increased. Okay, so there's a boost right here, if it's not in inverse mode, from 3,353 hertz to about 4,000-ish, I'm actually cutting.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. Took the
Because it's going to reduce that frequency, but you can see that little line
Looking in the mirror, love who I
bouncing
see.
down dependent on the attack, release, and the threshold, right? Well, if you have it in the inverse, if you invert that behavior, the filters are going to respond like an expander. So in inverse mode, this is going to be expansion now.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see.
It's going to make those frequencies a little bit more present and noticeable to the ear. So let's talk about what a good instance, or a kind of a setting or an instance in which you would like to use this. A common one would be to accentuate maybe a drum hit, like a snare. Snares usually have a pretty prominent narrow frequency, so if you could set this in an inverse mode and you could set it to expand and you could have it pop out of the mix, let's say if the snare wasn't loud enough, you can use that inverse mode. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty basic stuff inside of the dynamic EQ. It's basically just an EQ that can be either a multiband compressor or an expander, hence the name dynamic EQ, as opposed to just straight up a multiband compressor or multipressor. And the presets are a really cool way to learn. You can see that when they're kind of boosting this stuff, it's usually in the inverse mode, and when they're cutting it, it's just usually in the normal mode. So you can visually see what's happening. And I didn't really touch on the mid side, but that's a huge, huge, huge tool. So for instance, if we look at this stereo tape focus,
Looking
you can see that we are doing some multiband compression on this preset on the lows and highs on just the sides. So the mid has a complete different set of compression, multiband compression settings or expansion depending on what mode it is in, inverse or normal. So it's really cool that you have that control. A lot of multiband compressors out there don't give you the mid side, and this even gives you left and right, which is pretty neat as well.
Looking in the mirror.
All right, so later in the tutorial course, when we're actually going through the tips and tricks for each section, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about some just general ways in which you could use the multiband or the dynamic EQ and use the multiband compression or expansion to kind of polish your tracks. But I will see you in the next video where we are going to be moving on to the vintage EQ.